anyone who's a Back to the Future fan.
If you ask anyone who grew up in the 80s, they'll tell you Back to the Future wasn't just a movie. However, what most people don't realize is that the version that ended up on screen wasn't how it all began. Some of the scenes were buried so deep you would never spot them unless you knew where to look. So instead of going back to 1955, let's time travel into 20 weird facts they never told you. Number 20. Hollywood thought it was a terrible idea. It might be hard to imagine a world where Back to the Future didn't exist. Michael J. Fox, Christopher Lloyd, and the DeLorean. Back in the early 80s, none of it made sense, and Hollywood was right at the top of that list. So, what happened? When Bob Gale, the screenwriter, started shopping the script around, it didn't go well, and it was turned down more than 40 times. Shocked? Well, that's about how many times the movie wouldn't do any good. Everybody believed that time travel movies wouldn't sell, or that it was too soft. As a result, they wanted something wilder, like Porky's. Following these countless rejections, someone suggested they take it to Disney. However, this move did not help, not even an inch. One of the executives even said, "What's wrong with you people? This is Disney and you're handing us a movie about incest?" If you're wondering why they all thought that way, it's because that one awkward plot point with Marty and his teenage mom didn't land the way they had hoped. Everything, however, changed after Robert Zemeckis directed Romancing the Stone. That movie was a hit, and suddenly studios wanted to hear what he had lined up next. That's when Steven Spielberg stepped in, helped push things forward, and finally gave the project some weight. Even then, it wasn't all smooth. Universal's head at the time, Sid Sheinberg, liked the script but had some opinions. For one, Doc Brown was originally called Professor Brown, but Sheinberg thought that sounded too boring. "Kids don't like professors," he said. "Call him Doc." Then there was the chimpanzee. Yes, Doc Brown originally had a chimpanzee as his sidekick, but Sheinberg wasn't having it. "No movie with a chimp ever made money," he said. Gale tried as much as he could to make him see the reasons behind the idea. "What about those Clint Eastwood movies with the orangutan?" Sheinberg just shrugged and said, "That was an orangutan, not a chimp." With this, they decided to swap the chimp with a dog. Yet this wasn't the most change they effected in the script. When they realized the original time machine was a fridge, that idea didn't last long either. Zemeckis started worrying that kids might try climbing into refrigerators, and they had to scrap it too. Number 19. The clue hiding in plain sight. Most people watching Back to the Future for the first time don't catch it because they are either focused on the gadgets, the ticking clocks, or maybe even wondering where Doc is. However, exactly 58 seconds into the opening scene, there's a clue sitting right there on the screen. When the camera drifts through Doc Brown's lab, it's packed with clocks stacked on top of clocks, weird machines buzzing in the background, and half-built contraptions that probably haven't worked in years. But in the middle of it all, there's this small clock with a little figure hanging from the minute hand. If you blink, you'll miss it. But once you've seen the movie all the way through, it hits you like a brick. That tiny figure represents what happens at the end. Doc Brown hanging off the edge of the clock tower trying to connect the lightning cable before it's too late. Now, fans love to argue over that ending, from the timing to the lightning strike. The whole "how did they get it that exact" thing. The answers to these questions haven't been forthcoming either. While some say the math doesn't add up, others swear it's flawless. Here's what's more shocking. The whole image of a man dangling from a clock isn't just clever foreshadowing. It's also a direct reference to a 1923 film called Safety Last, where Harold Lloyd famously hangs from a giant clock face. Number 18, the title that almost ruined everything. Imagine growing up with a movie called Spaceman from Pluto. It doesn't sound interesting, right? That was almost the title of Back to the Future. Back when the script was going from hand to hand around the studio, Sid Sheinberg thought the movie was great, but he had his exceptions with the title. In a memo to Steven Spielberg, he suggested changing the title to Spaceman from Pluto, as he thought it sounded exciting and fun. Hold on, that's not just the only thing he wanted. He wanted the whole movie reworked around that title. One of his notes even included Marty introducing himself as the Spaceman from Pluto during the barn scene. Spielberg, however, didn't argue. Instead, he just replied with a letter saying, "Thanks for your hilarious memo. We all had a great laugh. Keep 'em coming." And just like that, Back to the Future stayed Back to the Future. 1 year later, it hit theaters and the storyline was just perfect. Number 17. The time machine was almost a fridge. Yes, Back to the Future had quite a lot of changes, and early versions of the movie plot looked very different. In the beginning, the time machine wasn't a car at all. It was a fridge. Remember when we mentioned that Zemeckis worried that kids might get into the fridge to time travel? That was it. The idea was that Marty would somehow survive a blast from a nuclear test site while hiding inside a refrigerator, but that version didn't last long. After they dropped the fridge idea, Bob Gale kept tinkering until he landed on a DeLorean. It had just the right amount of weirdness. The gull-wing doors, the brushed steel, and just the fact that the car looked like it came from outer space. There was also an intriguing backstory to this. John DeLorean himself had been busted for a massive substance deal just a couple of years earlier, and it synced with what they were searching for. However, just as things started kicking off, Ford stepped in with a check. They would give $75 grand if they swapped the DeLorean for a Mustang, but Bob Gale didn't even flinch. His answer was simple. Doc Brown doesn't drive a Mustang. Number 16, the Marty you never got to see. Did you know there was a different cast for Marty before Michael J. Fox stepped in? Well, this guy was Eric Stoltz. If you've seen Pulp Fiction, you'll remember him as the guy with the messy hair and the bathrobe who jammed a needle into Uma Thurman's chest. He's a great actor, no question. But when he starred earlier on in Back to the Future, something felt off. Now, Stoltz had already filmed for 5 weeks. That's over a month of footage, scenes, and setups. The problem, however, was that his tone just wasn't working. He was playing Marty like he was starring in a drama, not a comedy. And it was too serious for a role like that. Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale, who had always wanted Michael J. Fox in the role, finally pulled the plug. So they removed nearly $4 million worth of work and started over. When Michael J. Fox came in, he brought the right energy and everything seemed to fall into place, or so they thought. Number 15, people still think Eric Stoltz snuck into the final cut. When people ask if Eric Stoltz snuck into the final cut, the official word is no. The editors swear up and down that every single frame of Eric Stoltz was cut from Back to the Future after Michael J. Fox took over. However, not everyone's buying that. Some fans are convinced Stoltz was still in the movie, at least for a split second. One shot people always point to is the scene at the mall when Marty dived into the DeLorean right as the Libyans showed up. If you pause it just right, the guy scrambling into the car looks taller and different. Then there's Thomas F. Wilson, who played Biff. He once said that when he threw that punch in the diner, the person he was hitting wasn't Michael J. Fox because he was too tall. As a result, he was sure it was Stoltz. To be fair, however, he admits it could have just been a stunt double. Still, the idea that a tiny sliver of the first Marty might have survived all the reshoots has become one of those weird rabbit holes for fans who just can't stop watching frame by frame. And honestly, it makes rewatching the movie even more fun. Number 14, the schedule that nearly broke Michael J. Fox. When Michael J. Fox signed on to Back to the Future, everybody thought that things were now in place. However, he was still working on the set of Family Ties. Michael K. Fox was 22, and the network needed him on set. So for almost 4 months, he worked on both sets interchangeably. Now, this schedule wasn't just tight, it was exhausting. In his memoir Lucky Man, Fox broke it down, and it reads like a sleep-deprived fever dream. A Teamster driver would pick me up at 9:30 a.m. and take me to Paramount, he wrote. That's where Family Ties was filmed. I spent the day rehearsing that week's show, culminating in a run-through at approximately 5 p.m. each afternoon. You're about to say it sounds manageable, right? Until you hear what happened next. At 6, another Teamster driver would pick me up and shuttle me to Universal Studios or whatever far-flung location we were based that evening, where I would work on Back to the Future until just before sunrise. This happened every single night. By the time they wrapped in the early morning, Fox was beyond exhausted. I'd climb into the back of a production van with a pillow and a blanket, he said, and yet another driver would take me home again, sometimes literally carrying me into my apartment and dropping me into my bed. Unfortunately, he did not sleep in for so long. I would catch 2 or 3 hours of sleep before Teamster driver number 1 would reappear at my apartment, Fox wrote. Let himself in with a key I had provided, brew a pot of coffee, turn on the shower, and then rouse me to start the whole process all over again. Yet through all of it, he still made Marty McFly the great character he is today. Big ups to Michael. Number 13. The pine tree Marty accidentally erased from history. Everyone remembers the DeLorean, the hoverboards, and the lightning strike at the clock tower, but one of the funniest, most subtle time travel jokes in the entire Back to the Future trilogy is a pine tree. Or more specifically, the one Marty ran over without realizing he changed the future. Here's how it goes down. In the first movie, Marty met Doc Brown in the parking lot of Twin Pines Mall. That's the name you see on the sign. However, when Marty got blasted back to 1955, he ended up crashing onto the Peabody farm and took out one of the guy's two beloved pine trees while trying to escape in the DeLorean. Fast forward to the end of the movie, when Marty returned to 1985, Doc was alive, saved by a bulletproof vest, and they were back in the same parking lot. If you look closely, the mall sign wasn't the same anymore. It changed to Lone Pine Mall. In Part 3, Doc gave Marty a half-joking scolding that felt like a subtle callback to the pine tree incident. He acted like he genuinely wanted to preserve the timeline, but by that point, Doc had already thrown that rulebook out the window. He then decided to stay behind in the 1880s and start a life there. Number 12. The scarecrow slip you can't unsee. If you've watched Back to the Future more times than you care to admit, there's one moment at the Peabody farm that you cannot overlook. It's right when Marty first landed in 1955. He was flying through the night, disoriented, and crashed straight through a field. Then came the scarecrow. In the first shot, it was launched over the top of the DeLorean with its arms flailing and straw flying everywhere. However, in the very next shot, the scarecrow's face was somehow smashed against the windshield. Honestly, spotting it feels like you're beginning to question your reality. The kind where you pause the frame and think, wait, that makes no sense. Now that you know, good luck with ever unseeing it. Number 11. Eddie Van Halen's music. You know the scene where Marty throws on a radiation suit, sneaks into George McFly's room in the middle of the night, and sticks a cassette into his Walkman. He cranks it up, holds it to his dad's ear, and blasts guitar noises straight into his skull. "Silence, Earthling," he says. If you paused the tape, you would notice something written on it. Edward Van Halen. For years, fans weren't sure. Well, it turned out it was him. It wasn't a song. Eddie Van Halen cleared it up years later when someone asked him about it while he was in LA. It was his song, but don't try to Shazam it because it's not a track. In Eddie's words, it was just him playing a bunch of noise. So why did they decide to use Eddie's song? When the filmmakers tried to license the original Van Halen music, the band said no. But Eddie? He said yes. So instead of using a full song, Eddie Van Halen went into the studio and recorded a few seconds of pure noise. And because the full band hadn't given permission, they couldn't use the name Van Halen. So the tape was credited to Edward Van Halen instead. Number 10. The drunk on the bench was a mayor once. When Marty got back to 1985, after all that time travel chaos, he crashed the DeLorean straight into the front of a church. During that moment, a guy sleeping on the bench nearby woke up, looked at the wreck, and muttered, "Crazy drunk driver." Marty, without missing a beat, called him by name, Red. Now here's where it got strange. He was the original Red Thomas, the same Red who was running for mayor back in 1955. You could even see his campaign car driving around when Marty first arrived in the past. That's the same car Marty jumped on top of when he told the young busboy, Goldie Wilson, "You're gonna be mayor someday," which of course he eventually was. Red, on the other hand, wasn't so lucky. Somewhere between 1955 and 1985, his campaign for mayor didn't go the way he planned. In the alternate timeline, when Biff became rich and ruined Hill Valley, Red was still around, but this time he was crawling under the hood of a broken car. Marty bumped into him, and instead of saying "crazy drunk driver," Red called him a crazy drunk pedestrian. Number 9. From horses to 4x4s. Hill Valley might have changed a lot from 1885 to 1985, but one name didn't change. In the Old West, there was a man named Jeb Statler who sold horses. Fast forward 100 years, and that same family name is still standing, except now it's at a car dealership. In 1985, Marty dreamed of owning a black custom 4.4, and it's from Statler Toyota. Number 8. The football game that made Biff a believer. In Back to the Future Part 2, there was a strange moment that changed everything for young Biff. Old Biff showed up from the future and handed his younger self a copy of Gray's Sports Almanac, which was a cheat sheet for every major sports score for decades. However, when young Biff got it, he thought everything was a joke. So old Biff decided to prove it. How did he do this? They were sitting in a car and the radio was on. In that moment, it was the fourth quarter of the UCLA versus Washington football game. UCLA was down 17-16. Then the announcer on the radio sounded defeated. It was all over for UCLA, he said. Old Biff leaned in and calmly predicted, "No, UCLA is going to win it 19-17. At that moment, as if on cue, UCLA won by 2 points, exactly like he said. That's when young Biff believed him and started to listen. If this one prediction was real, what about the next one and the one after that? However, here's the wild part. UCLA wasn't just part of the movie because the game also happened in real life. On the 12th of November, 1955, number 4 ranked UCLA beat Washington 19-17 at home with 18 seconds left on the clock. Jim Decker kicked a 35-yard field goal to win it. The movie got the score right, and they even mentioned Decker's name. The radio broadcast in the film, however, wasn't an exact replica. Number 7, why Calvin Klein wasn't Marty's name in France. In the original Back to the Future, when Marty woke up in 1955 after crashing into a barn, he found himself in Lorraine's bedroom. She thought he was called Calvin Klein, all because that's the name written on his underwear. It's funny, but here's what's strange. That joke didn't land the same way in every country. In the French version of the movie, Lorraine didn't call him Calvin Klein. She called him Pierre Cardin. So why do you think they made this change? Well, Calvin Klein wasn't as well known in France at the time, so they swapped it for a designer name that French audiences would immediately recognize. So if you ever watch the French dub, don't be surprised when Marty's underwear suddenly changes labels. Number 6, Doc Brown didn't have a permit and he improvised. While the movie was based on time travel, Marty McFly wasn't trying to travel through time. He just wanted to meet up with Doc Brown at the mall parking lot. Then the Libyans showed up, the DeLorean took off, and suddenly he was stuck in 1955 with no way back. The only person who could help was a much younger Doc, who didn't even believe Marty at first. Once he saw the time machine and heard about the lightning strike at the clock tower, things started to fall into place. Doc figured out that lightning could deliver exactly what they needed, which was 1.21 gigawatts of electricity, and this was the only way to get Marty back home. So they made a plan to use the bolt that was going to hit the clock tower on Saturday night. Here's something easy to miss in that scene when Marty was slipping the warning note into Doc's jacket. When you look behind him, you can see Doc talking to a cop. Apparently, setting up a giant hook and cables all over the street wasn't something you could do without permission. The officer then asked if Doc had a permit for this so-called weather experiment, but he didn't. So Doc reached into his coat, pulled out some cash, and handed it over. Number 5, the USA Today front page. In Back to the Future Part 2, there was a blink and you'll miss detail that still got fans talking, and that was the USA Today front page. Doc showed Marty the paper to explain what happened to his future son. Meanwhile, the date on the paper said October 22, 2015. That's the day after Future Day, which is why it made the cut. Forget Marty's kid for a second. Let's take a look at the headlines. Right there in bold, Cubs sweep series in 5. What does this mean? Now, back in 1989, when this film came out, the Cubs hadn't won a World Series since 1908. At that time, the idea of them sweeping anyone seemed like a joke. At the time, there was also no baseball team in Miami. The Marlins didn't exist until 1993, when they were originally called the Florida Marlins and later switched to Miami. Here's the catch. Both the Cubs and Marlins are in the National League, and the chances that they would ever meet in the World Series were 0. So, the headline, Sweep in 5, was the real World Series best of 7. So the paper hinted at a future where it's best of 9. However, this isn't the only noticeable feature. In the article, there's talk of Queen Diana, and for some reason all of Marty Jr. DS drama gets stuffed into the sports section. Now, the filmmakers might have missed the internet entirely, but strangely, the fast-changing headlines kind of hinted at the wild, never-stop scroll pace of modern news. Number 4, why George McFly vanished from the sequels. If you notice something felt off about George McFly in the sequels, you weren't wrong. Crispin Glover, who played him in the first film, didn't come back for Part 2 or Part 3. He showed up, however, for a split second in Part 2, but that's just recycled footage from the first movie, the Enchantment Under the Sea dance. Any other scene you see with George is a stand-in. In one shot, he was even hanging upside down in some weird back-stretching machine at the McFly home in Hilldale. The reason given in the movie was that he threw his back out. Later, it's casually mentioned he was murdered, and that's about all we get. So why wasn't Glover in the sequels? He wanted more than the studio was willing to give. There's also the fact that he didn't agree with how the story ended either. He felt the message was all wrong and that Marty shouldn't be rewarded with money or a fancy car just because he fixed the past. Instead of working it out, the studio hired a double and used makeup and camera tricks to make him look like Glover. This didn't sit well with Glover, though. He sued, and it led to major changes in Hollywood rules about using actors' likenesses without their permission. Number 3. The one person who always believed in bringing the movie to life. From the start, Steven Spielberg thought Back to the Future was gold. He read the script and was ready to get it made with Universal right away. Unfortunately, not everybody thought it was gold. On the other side of executives not willing to work with this script were Bob Gale and Robert Zemeckis, who hit the brakes. Why? They were nervous. They had already worked with Spielberg on 3 movies in a row. None of those films had done well at the box office. As a result, they didn't want to look like the guys who only got work because of their famous friends. However, this narrative changed quickly when Zemeckis directed Romancing the Stone, which turned out to be a big hit. Suddenly, he had the power to pick his next project without needing anyone's approval. So he and Gale finally said yes to doing Back to the Future, this time with Universal and Spielberg's new company, Amblin Entertainment. Number 2. John DeLorean didn't expect this kind of comeback. John DeLorean wasn't exactly riding high when Back to the Future came out. His car company had already gone under, and the stainless steel sports car he built, the DeLorean DMC-12, was considered more of a flop than a future icon. Then the movie became a hit. Suddenly, that gull-winged car was the star of a time travel adventure. People loved it. With that, the DeLorean became legendary almost overnight. After the film took off, John DeLorean wrote a letter to Robert Zemeckis, the director. In it, he said, "Thanks for continuing my dream in such a positive fashion." Number 1. Back to the Future started with a yearbook. Bob Gale didn't come up with Back to the Future while sitting in a studio or working on a big production. He was in his parents' basement, digging through old boxes when he found his dad's high school yearbook. As he flipped through it, something hit him. Would he and his dad have even been friends if they had gone to school together at the same age? That little question stuck in his head. Later, he brought it up to Robert Zemeckis. They kept talking about it, then they realized they could make a movie out of this. It could circle around a teenager who goes back in time and meets his parents. Somehow his mom ends up falling for him. Awkward? Definitely, but the idea worked. It gave them the bones of a story they knew they had to write. What's more, the people who worked on Back to the Future didn't just show up, act, and make a hit movie. They loved being there. One of the biggest reasons was Robert Zemeckis. Ask anyone in the main cast and they will tell you the same thing. Working with Zemeckis was a gift. Michael J. Fox said they clicked right away. "We understood each other perfectly," he said. "He's a great artist." Leah Thompson noticed how much detail he put into every single moment. His attention to detail is second to none. That's what makes him such a great storyteller. Tom Wilson, who played Biff, might have said it best in a very 1980s kind of way. He must have a 100-megabyte hard disk in his brain. Back then, 100 megabytes was a massive deal. So, Zemeckis didn't just run the show. He kept it all fun while holding every thread of the story together in his head. And that's all for 20 of the weirdest Back to the Future facts. Which one hit you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Before you go, explore the other videos on your screen.